Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. So today we have a special live edition of Ask Octopus. My name is James Chapmas, and I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Octopus Deploy. Now, before we dive into the main event here, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to go over with you. This webinar will be recorded. No need to worry about that, and we'll be sharing the recording with you via email in a few days. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Zoom Q&A or in our community Slack channel. There's a webinar channel there. Ryan and I will be monitoring those and answering the questions as they come in, so please do send some along our way. Speaking of Ryan, would like to introduce my colleague and co-host for this webinar, Ryan Russo.
Hey, thanks, James. Hello, everybody. Ready to get started, answer some questions? All right, so as James mentioned, we're going to be answering questions today, especially your questions. We did ask for some questions to be sent in ahead of time so we could prepare some content for the webinar, but we'll be checking the Q&A feature of Zoom and that webinar channel, as he mentioned, as we go along. So we'll probably do 2 of the prepared questions, check for some live questions, a few more of the prepared questions, and kind of alternate back and forth. So if you have any questions, go ahead and start sending those in now, and we'll check them after a few of these questions that were sent in. So let's go to the first question. And James, I'm going to pose this one to you. I'm gonna 2-part it. So I'll take care of how, right? How do I customize the Octopus dashboard? Why, James, would I customize the Octopus dashboard?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of times you might have a number of dev managers working on, kind of a larger application. Maybe they only want to see the deployments of the projects that their team is working on. They don't need all the extra noise. Additionally, you could customize the dashboard based on, potentially the sprint, the block of work your team's currently working on, and you just want to see certain pieces of the application on the dashboard. So a couple of use cases there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was the use case that was sent in. I have the projects that we are deploying kind of changes from sprint to sprint. How do I configure my dashboard each sprint to show those projects? So we'll switch over to our handy dandy demo site. I've got a few projects set up here. I actually have more than just these 2. So I've already configured my dashboard to show a few projects that I want to look at throughout the webinar. But let me step back. The configure button, it's kind of up in the corner here. It may sneak by you. You may not have noticed it before, but if you are interested in configuring your dashboard, this configure button here, once you click on that configure, you'll have a few different options on how to filter out the projects that you want to see. One is by project group. So if you have your projects already grouped into some sort of system, maybe by team, maybe by product suite or components, something like that, you can choose for a specific component. So if I wanted my microservices to show up, for example, I could choose that, and then they would be available on my dashboard. Not exactly wanting to do that right now, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next section, which is projects. This is the one I probably use the most. I just want to look at specific projects. Like I said, I have many projects that are already hidden right now. So if I wanted to add one, I could add one, or if I wanted to remove, say, random quotes and only look at OctoFX on my dashboard for the remainder, I can do that. There's a few extra options down here as well. You could also filter to specific environments. Maybe you're only interested in the production environment. Maybe you're only interested in dev and test. You can limit your view that way, as well as limit it to specific tenants if you do have the tenant feature in use in your projects. Once you're happy with your filters, click on save and then navigate back to your dashboard, and you'll have the projects or the groups and the environments that you've selected on your dashboard for viewing. So that is how you would configure it. James gave us the answer on why. So if you're not aware, that's something you can do. Very handy, especially if you have access to a lot of projects, especially if you're an admin of your Octopus server, can be very handy to kind of cut through that noise here.
Yeah, it can certainly make things a little more efficient. And just to clarify for those of us that are new, this doesn't take away your permissions or your ability to access those projects, correct?
That's right. It just changes the view of your dashboard. You can still go to the projects menu and see all of your projects laid out. You can still access those other projects if you want to look at those. My favorite way of getting around Octopus is quickly becoming the project switcher, one of the newer features that we've introduced in the last few years. So you can search for specific projects. You can also just see a list of projects that are available, and at the top, it has your recently viewed, so you can easily kind of switch back and forth between recently viewed projects without going back to your dashboard or the project menu. Project switcher is a very nice way to get around. But no, exactly what you said. It doesn't take away your permissions. It just limits what you see on the dashboard by default.
Great. Super handy. All right. So moving on, question 2. So can I deploy to multiple test environments before promoting a release, down the line, eventually to production?
Yeah, you can do that. I guess to clarify, because there's like 2 different ways you can do this, right, James? You can deploy to those test environments in sequence. Like maybe I go to a manual test and then an automated test and then maybe a user acceptance test, and those could flow one at a time. You can also have multiple test environments that get deployed to in parallel, right?
Right. Yeah. So for this question specifically, extra information sent with it. So this is a organization that has 2 discrete QA teams that, and they both test different pieces of the application. So the testing happens in parallel, and they both need to pass before promoting that release.
Yep. So we can do that. You would do that through our life cycles feature, well, in combination with our environments feature. So one thing you can do is, so I have 4 OctoFX development, test, and production. You can go in and add another test environment. So if I head over to environments, let's add in a second test, just for the sake of naming, let's call this one QA instead of test 2 or something like that. And once we save that and save the details, if we head back to the dashboard, we'll see that it has added this environment. Now, James, probably not the location we want that environment to be added in, right?
Typically not after production, right?
QA definitely comes before production, or we do testing in production, right? So the reason why it's showing up in that order is because we're still using the default lifecycle in Octopus, which is great for getting started. It does help you move kind of quickly from setting up Octopus into being able to deploy into your environments. The way it works is by default, it's going to take the order of the environments and all of the environments that you define on this screen. So if I reorder these environments and I move QA up to after the test environment, for example, let's say QA is manual testing, test is automated testing. By changing that order, that's going to change the order on the life cycle, the default life cycle. So now I have to go development to test to QA and then to production. But that's not exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to go to test and QA at the same time, be successful in both of those, and then move to production. So that's where creating a custom lifecycle would come into play. So we'll head over to the library menu and the lifecycles. If you're new to Octopus, you may not have been into this menu before. Like I said, that default lifecycle gets you really far. You can go probably for dozens and dozens of deployments without needing to create a separate lifecycle or a custom lifecycle. I do like showing it because it does have a lot of benefits around just knowing how that works and knowing how to create a new one. So we'll go ahead and add a lifecycle, and we'll call this one, let's say, OctoFX. So this will be a lifecycle specific to our OctoFX project. I'm going to leave the retention policy at the defaults. That's another good reason to come in and look at your lifecycles, check out retention policy, what that means, make sure you've got those settings the way you would want them. But what I want to do now is set some phases. So this is essentially what the default lifecycle looks like when you go into it. There's no phases defined, and it just uses that default convention of I'm going to deploy to the environments in that order you specified in the infrastructure screen. To override that, we will add phases. And a phase is a group of environments you deploy to. In most cases, it's going to be a one-to-one. I'm going to have a development phase with a development environment, a test phase with a test environment, production with production. But you can have multiple environments in a single phase. You could have a production phase that includes your production environment and your failover disaster recovery, or maybe multiple regionalized environments. So you don't have to set those up as separate phases. They can all be one. So I'm going to kind of move through these and set up development. Almost forgot how to spell development in the the midst of the webinar. Would have been embarrassing. And I'm going to add my environment to the development phase, right? So I'm going to choose the development environment. And here we get to see an option, one of these benefits of customizing the lifecycle. By default, you have to go and manually queue a deployment to an environment. We do have the option to automatically deploy to an environment as soon as that release enters the phase. So if in the development phase, if it's just created, I create a release, that first phase would be development. It's going to auto deploy to development. If I had this set in the test phase, it could auto deploy to my test environment after the development one is successful. You can go all the way to production like that. So if you're looking for more of a continuous deployment style where you are auto deploying to each environment, definitely check out custom lifecycles, check out this option for auto deploying. I'm going to be a little more conservative in my deployment strategy today and not quite go full auto deploy, but I've added my first environment, my first phase. You do have some options on required to progress, which is what we're actually going to talk about when we get into the test phase. So I'm going to minimize that one. I'm going to add our testing phase, and I'm going to add two environments here. So I'm going to add test. And because I want to deploy to test and QA at the same time before moving to production, I'm going to add two environments. So one phase, two environments. And the required to progress is really how we determine when we can move to the next phase. All must complete means all must be green, right? All must be successful before we can move to the next phase. That means successful in test and QA. That's what we want in the context of this question. I could also put a minimum. I have to be successful in one of these two. Doesn't have to be both, doesn't have to be specifically test or QA. Just one of these needs to be successful before I can move on. I can also mark it completely optional. I can completely skip my testing phase and go directly to my production deployment. Again, probably don't want to do that, just like you don't want to have QA after production. But that's handy if you do have some life cycles or some flow between your phases where some would be optional. And we'll show an example of that a little bit later too. I'm going to leave these as all must complete. And I'm going to add in my last phase, which is going to be the production phase. Add our production environment and just leave all of those default settings there. And once I save this, it will create the lifecycle, but it's not quite in use yet. So we've created the lifecycle. We can even see the preview at the bottom, dev, two environments in the test phase, and production. Switch over to OctoFX, and we can set the process. We can set the lifecycle being used by going to the process and changing the process used. So we're going to change from the default lifecycle, which is a little bit wrong, not quite what we want. And we want to change this to our OctoFX lifecycle. Get the preview, that looks right. Once we hit save, we're now using that. Now this kind of works a little bit weird when you change your lifecycle on an existing project, because some of your deployments may have been followed certain rules in the past and now they're different rules. So we can see this release in the top hasn't gone to development yet, can't go to test, QA, or production. The .56 release has been successful in development. It can go to test and QA, but not production. Likewise, 55 has gone to test, but not QA. It has to be successful in both, right, James? So successful in test, successful in QA before we can move on to the production environment. The ones that are already in production, they were in production before we changed the life cycle. So that's one thing to be aware of if you are changing the life cycle in an existing project, as you may see a little weirdness in your dashboard for existing releases.
Right. And yeah, so just to clarify, it does need to be successful in both of those environments. It's not just a regular deployment to each of them.
Right. Yeah, you would need to be successful there. Right.
And kind of a follow-up question. So you created this new life cycle. It's slightly different than the default one. Do you recommend that users go in and create these custom life cycles for their projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, default lifecycle is great. It's really there for getting you started. To really understand what your project is doing and all of the capabilities you have at hand, I always recommend going in and setting up a custom lifecycle with your environments, setting up your retention policies to be exactly what you want, and then setting up those phases to be exactly what you need. And I do that with my demo sites. I do that with my own personal Octopus instance where I run my personal projects. I always create a custom lifecycle.
Perfect.
Right. We got a few live questions in, James. So one is there a bulletproof way to prevent scripts and packages from running even when people have access to modify project variables?
Yeah, good question.
So I may need a little bit more on this question. So are we talking about like a deploy.ps1 or a deploy.sh file inside of a package that's going to run by convention? And we're looking away for disabling these. I think you can disable that by setting a variable in the project, but then that comes back to the question of what if they have the ability to modify those variables? I think if you have access to modify those variables, that's indeed what we're talking about, and you have access to modify those variables, I can look into it. I don't know anything off the top of my head beyond that you would be able to stop that script from running, because that is a convention built in. Likewise, it's kind of the same thing as like if you have access to update those variables, you really have a lot of influence over the deployment process, right? Because you're probably using those for your app settings, probably using those for different fields within your configuration. So you'd probably want to maybe restrict access for those variable edits. Within the context of variable permissions, you can scope to like an environment. So you could limit, say this team has access to modify the deployment process and set variables, but not production variables, for example. So that maybe adds an extra layer. Is it bulletproof? That's going to depend on, again, how much permission you get, like how much access and permissions you give to your teams.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Nothing to add from my end, but you hit the nail on the head with that one, right?
All right. Sounds good. All right. So thanks for that live question. Like I said, we're going to kind of jump back and forth between the live and prepared questions. So jump back to the slides.
All right. So question 3, user wrote in, loves Octopus for deployments, but also looking to get a build server online, wanted to know which ones are compatible with Octopus Deploy. And for this question, Ryan, I'm going to kind of rattle off a few of our most popular build servers and let me know if those work with Octopus.
All right, let's go.
All right, AppVeyor.
Yeah, AppVeyor has like built-in integration for Octopus.
Perfect. Azure DevOps and or Team Foundation server.
Yes. Yeah, but we got an extension for both of those.
Bamboo.
Bamboo, yes, we do have a plugin for Bamboo. I'm trying to use the right terminology because each one calls them something different. It's a plugin or extension. I'm probably going to mess it up. But yeah, we definitely have a plugin or an extension for Bamboo.
Perfect. How about Bitbucket pipelines?
Yeah, our colleague Mark has set up some examples of using Bitbucket pipelines, even written some example pipes that can be reused.
Shout out to Mark on that. How about Circle CI, Ryan?
Yep, same. What Mark did for Bitbucket pipes, I did with Circle CI, kind of figured out how that would work in the context of Circle CI, including constructing or fashioning what they call an orb, so that reusable YAML that you can use to integrate with Octopus.
Great, shout out to you on that one. How about GitHub Actions?
Yeah, we have publicly available official GitHub Actions that you can use from GitHub to talk to Octopus.
All right, Jenkins.
Oh, Jenkins, man. Yeah, both ways of deploying to Jenkins, classic style build jobs and the pipeline build jobs, extensions / plugins for each of those.
All right, and last but certainly not least, TeamCity.
TeamCity, yeah, my build tool of choice at some point in previous professional life. Definitely got a plugin for that. Used it quite a bit.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, anything that we didn't mention, any new CI tools that pop up, next week, something that hasn't been named yet or hasn't quite broken into the mainstream yet, if we don't have a plugin for it, that's something that can be facilitated through our CLI, which calls our API. Octopus is built API first, so all of these actions are available through our REST API. And our CLI is usually the basis for those extensions or plugins we build. So even if there's something that we don't have an official plugin for, we can still work with it through that CLI being incorporated into a build process. Let's take a little field trip over to Azure DevOps and just kind of look at what a plugin could look like to integrate with Octopus. So we'll take a look at Azure DevOps specifically because I've got it kind of handy and available. Been working with it today. You can kind of see from my builds running. If we edit this pipeline, we'll see just a pretty traditional build pipeline, right? We're building a .NET project. We're doing some NuGet restore. We're building a solution. I am pushing to a few different repositories because we do test and work with a bunch of different ones. But the main thing you'll see here is these last 3 steps. This is from our extension for Azure DevOps and Team Foundation Services. So we have the ability to go in and push packages directly up to the Octopus repository if you're not using an external feed. Also have the ability to push build information. So that's a link back to the build that actually ran it. That's a link to any work items or any commits maybe associated with those packages that were uploaded. And then finally, we're actually creating a release, and you can even deploy the release from your CI server plugin or extension. So it's going to create a release in a specific space within a specific project. We're setting the release number to be the same as our Azure DevOps build number. And all of that's going to work. So this build will actually create that release. I don't think I have the deployment set, but if I wanted to, I could also have it auto deploy out to my first environment. So we did see that, right? You can set this auto deploy idea at your lifecycle level. You can also set it in your CI level, especially for those lower level environments. All right, so that's what a build project can look like. Let's jump back. And James, all right, let's talk about emergency releases. So again, I'll kind of show how we can do emergency or hotfix releases in Octopus. The astute viewer may have seen some hints of that along the way in some of our earlier answers. Let's kind of talk about what some differences between you may find in like an emergency release versus a normal mainstream or mainline release in Octopus.
Right. So typically, if you want to deploy a hotfix or an emergency release, there was a security issue that was identified, needs to get fixed on a very tight timeline. Maybe the QA team's gone home for the day. It's a straightforward fix, and we just want to make the change, and it's been deemed safe enough to once it's built, essentially go directly to production. So in Octopus, as we saw with the life cycle, the default life cycle, we have to go sequentially through each of our environments before making it to production. But a hotfix or emergency deployment would theoretically skip some of those middle environments in the essence of time, for example.
Yeah, that's right. So you probably have a different flow through your environments, probably limited, maybe skipping dev. Another thing I see kind of frequently, depending on the specific team's development practices, you may have that hotfix or emergency build built from a completely different branch, right? Again, it kind of depends. Are they doing trunk-based development? Or are they using something like Git flow? Like where that build comes from, it could be the same branch as their main releases. It could be a separate one. So that's another thing that could come out. Even if it's the same branch in source control, it could be a different build in their CI server that maybe does some extra steps, maybe tags the version a little bit different, which is actually what I'll show. And what am I waiting for? Let's switch over back to demo and kind of look at how a hotfix works. So we're going to combine a newly introduced idea with an idea we're about to introduce. So life cycles again. So we're going to kind of go back to our idea of life cycles. I already have a pre-existing hotfix life cycle. You don't have to watch me create another one from scratch. But this one, we'll just kind of walk through the phases and talk about what they are. So for my emergency release, I don't want to go to development. I want to go to test and production. I've even marked test as optional here. So you can see it's my optional phase. I could skip test, YOLO straight up to production. Not necessarily going to say you should do that, but you could do that if you're comfortable with the ramifications of that. And then production is just a simple phase, same phase as my other life cycles. The only difference here is that I have no development phase. I only have a test phase. It's optional. And then we're going to production. So how do we use this within our project? The answer is through channels. And this is another feature that, like the default lifecycle, will get you a long way without you maybe even realizing that they're there or what they do, because every project comes with a default channel and it just works. If you don't have the need for a channel, you may have never looked at it. You may not have added it unless you're just like extra curious and jumped into the channels menu on your project. You may not have worked with these yet. So channels let you do is basically branch your deployment process. And what do I mean by that? That could be maybe going to different life cycles in the case of a hotfix. That could be running different steps or using different configuration variables. So in the case of something like I have a version 1 of my deployment process versus a version 2 of my deployment process or my app deployment process. You could have steps that run in one channel and not the other, variable values that are different per channel. So that's one thing that you could use it for. So for the hotfix channel that I've created, I've set the lifecycle. So this is how you choose what lifecycle is associated with the channel. It is not my default channel. I don't want all of my releases to be hotfixes, though. I'll speak for myself. I have been on teams before where it has felt like most of our releases were hotfixes. So pre-Octopus and better DevOps practices. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you do make that your default for a little while until everything gets a little more stable. But the other thing we do add in is a version rule. So you can set version ranges or version requirements for a channel. And I've done that with the hotfix channel. I'm looking specifically for packages with versions that have a hotfix pre-release tag. It could be any pre-release tag. I've just named it hotfix. You can have it be the branch name or anything else. And James, I think you've used this for a few different things too, right? Like so feature branches and things like that.
Yeah. The specifically those package version rules with pre-release tags. If you have a bunch of developers doing work in a feature branch and you don't want to risk any of those packages making it into your default lifecycle, your main line, setting these filters and these version rules, it can certainly help with that.
And the way this works is when we create the release, since we have 2 channels now, we get to choose the channel that this release is going to belong to. So I'm going to expand my packages out so we can see how this affects that version rule affects the chosen packages. So if I choose my hotfix channel, we're going to see it's making some changes here. It's specifically looking for a hotfix release. And if I switch back, you can see that it switch backs to like the normal release version numbering scheme.
Right. So Ryan, just for everyone's reference here, what happens if you're in this hotfix channel and you try to select a version of a package that doesn't have that pre-release tag?
Yeah, you can do that. You have to click a few checkboxes to make it work. So one is to look for versions that are not in this channel. You'll get a little info token here that says, hey, doesn't satisfy the channel rules. No problem. I know what I'm doing. Click OK. You'll get another one like, hey, doesn't really match the rules that you've set up. You have to check this box before you can save it. If I try to save it without acknowledging the fact that I'm choosing something that doesn't match the channel rules, I'd have to go, I get an error message. So I'd have to force that package selection. But I don't really want to do that. I just want to select my hotfix package version and then click on save. And once this release is created, we'll see that I can deploy directly to test, no dev environment in the lifecycle. And it's optional, James, I can deploy directly to production if I need to. And it's also represented on the overview, right? In my channel here, I've got my release that was just created. I can go to test or production.
Perfect.
All right, James, what we got in the way? Let's do a couple of live questions.
Yeah, so we do have a few that have come in. Here's a great one from Francis. So for IAS deployments, can we update the SSL certificate without having to create a new release?
No, I don't. James, do you know? I don't think you can. I think you have to create a new release.
Yeah, that's right. So for it to pick up that new certificate that you've added to your Octopus instance, you would have to create a new release for that.
Yeah, I'm gonna say let's double check that and follow up, because I know
Yes.
there's a few things that if they are set as variables that it can change. I guess it depends on whether the variable points to a certificate that was updated or if it points to a new certificate completely. So I guess the answer may change based on that, but where's the bindings? Yeah, and I don't have any certificates available here, so it's going to not show up with anything. So yeah, so you have to select a certificate variable. So yeah, I think in this case you would need to use a new release, or the thing you can do is go to an existing release and update the variable snapshot. So if you've changed the variable to point to a new certificate, that is available on the release side of things. If you scroll down, you can see the variable snapshot. You can even see the variables that are going to be used. You can update the variables with the latest. Now, this is for the whole snapshot. This is going to update all of the variables, not just that certificate variable, but yeah, that's just the caveat there. Beware that you may be updating things that you're not anticipating to update. I'd say too, if you're looking at certificates, there may be a use case for runbooks there to do just a certificate update outside of a full deployment.
Yeah, that is a great use case when is just kind of doing those one-off type tasks, which leads right to another question that we have. What are some good use cases for runbooks, Ryan?
Oh, a whole lot of stuff. The categories I usually put them in, right, are maintenance tasks. So things like running backups, running Windows updates or Linux updates, OS updates, emergency tasks, maybe restarting an IIS site or restarting IIS that's being a little mischievous, restoring a backup restoring a database from a backup. Maybe switching your DNS to point to your failover system versus your production system. That could be a good emergency runbook, as well as the other big case is infrastructure as code, right? So running some infrastructure as code tasks to either create or maintain your deployment targets. Let's do another live question while we're here. Actually, I'm going to ask for a clarification. One, it says, how can one incorporate Octopus with AWS? That's a pretty broad topic. Do you mean deploying to AWS or hosting the Octopus server within AWS? Because both are possible. I just want to make sure that I'm answering the right question. And then the question I'll bring up now is there an API to collect the info about the last time the projects were deployed? James, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so there certainly can be crafted with API calls. Don't have an example in front of me right now. That being said, the Octopus CLI has a built-in command for that, and it's Octo list deployments, and there's a number of flags you can use, such as environment or tenant or project, but that will bring back the latest deployments for the parameters that you provide.
Yeah, exactly that. There's also, we have a reporting endpoint that has some of that information. And then it's also the dashboard API. So this project overview and this dashboard, those are API driven too. So the information you're looking for is on your dashboard. I'd look at those API endpoints as well. So probably a few different ways to find that depending on exactly what you're looking for. All right, so let's jump back to the prepared questions. And this one is me. I think we had a little bit of a preview of this. We kind of touched on this briefly. But can I apply Terraform templates with Octopus, James?
Emphatic yes on that one. So that functionality is built into Octopus Deploy. Not only Terraform, but ARM templates, CloudFormation templates, basically any infrastructure as code libraries that you're using, Octopus can almost certainly run those as either part of a deployment process itself or separately in a runbook, as you mentioned a few moments ago.
Yeah, and I think that leads to like an interesting question, which is where should it be? Should it be in my deployment process or should it be in a runbook? And I kind of dread giving the answer. It depends, but the good news is it depends on like how you want to deploy your applications, how you want to manage your infrastructure. Octopus is going to work both ways. It's going to work whichever way is best for you. So that could be in the case of I have a deployment process that creates an Azure web app and immediately deploys to it. What's nice is we actually have a feature coming out that supports this really well, especially around dynamic infrastructure and dynamic infrastructure detection. So it will automatically pull up or pick up any infrastructure created by ARM templates or Terraform scripts or Pulumi or anything like that. Is you just got to tag your infrastructure when you create it, and Octopus can register it automatically. Looking forward for that landing in an upcoming version. But if you want to always create or update your infrastructure tied to deploying your application, maybe you're always spinning up new infrastructure for your deployments, then the deployment process makes sense, right? You would want that to be in your deployment process. A lot of people would wonder if that takes a lot of time to run. It can, but especially if you're just updating existing infrastructure and you're using state files, it's pretty quick. Like it'll Terraform or whatever you're using would see that that infrastructure exists, and they'll just make the modifications. And if there are none, it'll just move on to the next step. So if you do want to have your infrastructure and deployments tightly coupled, then deployment process is where you would put it. But we also support the other method of creating your infrastructure, which is maybe you just want to create the infrastructure once and run it, maybe modify it or update it periodically, maybe on a schedule using one of our runbook triggers. A runbook's great for that. So now you can update and create your infrastructure outside of the context of an application deployment. And maybe there's cases where you want a little bit of both. I want to be able to create my infrastructure, but deploy to it later. And I have it in my deployment process just in case the runbook hasn't been run recently. So you can also do both if you choose.
Perfect.
Actually, I think this was a live question that I came in, and I was I got pretty excited, James, because I saw it come in. I was like, oh, we have that one already.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was asked live as well. But how do I deploy a group of applications at the same time, Ryan?
Yeah, so two answers, and it's going to depend on your application architecture and how you'd like to do things within Octopus. Because technically you can deploy a group of applications inside a single project in Octopus. If I switch back to demo and we take a look at OctoVex, it's a very small example of this. I've seen projects that teams use that deploy dozens of applications all within one deployment process. Doable. That's more of like a monolithic structure or architecture, right? All of these services depend on each other. They all get built at the same time. They all get the same version. You're pushing them out. Kind of have that model of OctoVex. I'm doing database changes. I'm doing a Windows service. I'm deploying a website all at the same time. So that's one way of doing it. If you're more on the microservice side of things, or closer to microservices at least, where each of your applications or each of your components are a different project. So each of these projects are deploying to Kubernetes, and they're all deploying a single application, a single container. So web app is separate from my API containers. Database and migrations are run separately. I can deploy each of these individually, don't have to deploy them as a group. But if for some reason I want to, James, say like we've haven't necessarily built them together, nor they're not tied in, but they've all been tested in development or the test environment together. And we want to push that as like a bundle of these deployments. And especially if we need to, or just want to specify the order that they deploy in, that's where a built-in step called the deploy a release step can come in. So each of these are projects deploying to Kubernetes. The app orchestrator project here is a application that deploys releases from other projects. So I'd go in and add a step for every project that I want to bundle together. I put the order. So steps by default in Octopus run sequentially, kind of talking about sequential and parallel and a few different questions here. But they'll run, so it'll run my approval in production first. It'll deploy my database project, my migrations project, but then my API projects, as long as my database is out there, I'm okay if they run together. So I actually marked these two steps to run in parallel. So it'll deploy both APIs in parallel. Once those have finished, once those both have finished, it will deploy my web app. And the way this looks, instead of choosing a Docker container or a zip file or a jar file from some type of artifact repository, we're choosing a project within the same space that we have access to. And then we'll choose a release as the quote unquote package, but then we have some options, right? What's the deployment condition? Always deploy, only if it's different, only if it's a higher version. And we can even pass in variables to that spawned child deployment if we want to modify it based on being deployed as a group. When we create a release, we are choosing different versions of those applications to release, different releases of those applications. So this doesn't map to a container image, it doesn't map to a zip file, it maps to a release in the database project or the project API project. And then, yeah, when everything looks good, we click on deploy and we send that out, and it's going to deploy out the orchestrator project, which is going to run through and deploy each of those projects in the order and the style that we've specified. So we head back to the dashboard, we'll see that this is going to run the whole time. As it's running, we'll see database deploy, migrations will run next. The product and shopping cart API will kind of run in order there, or run in parallel there, and then we'll get the web app. So that's how you can, two different methods of grouping applications, one in one project that deploys everything all at once, or two with a orchestrator or a coordinator project utilizing the deploy a release step to push those as a group.
That's great.
All right, let's check in on our live questions. So still got the AWS question there. Like I said, a little clarification there if you wanted to add in some extra info on whether you were looking to host Octopus in AWS or deploy to AWS. We may just go ahead and answer both of those, maybe, James.
Yeah, I think that's probably fine.
Yeah, so it'll depend on what your deployment targets are within AWS. EC2 instances install a tentacle on them, and we can connect to them just like a virtual machine anywhere else. We do have support for EKS as a Kubernetes target and ECS as another container platform target. All of that would be under the infrastructure. So if we head over to the infrastructure tab, I've got GKE, I've got Google Kubernetes clusters here, but that could easily be a EKS cluster. You would just choose your authentication method here. So you would need to connect an AWS account. We can pull the service role from a EC2 worker instance that's registered as a worker from Octopus. So you don't necessarily need to register an account within infrastructure, but easiest way to get started, a little more advanced way, use a role with an EC2 based worker. Like I said, EKS supported, ECS supported, Lambdas coming soon. You can deploy to Lambdas without targets being there, but the target that will make those deployments a little bit nicer experience in the future is coming soon. So that's the main way of deploying or integrating with AWS from a deployment side.
Yeah, and then just to quickly tack on to the end of that, ECR can be set up as a feed in Octopus as well.
That's a good point. ECR, not only ECR, but S3, that's a new change that's coming. So if you're on the cloud, you may see it already as an external feed option. So yeah, for your container registry, we do have ECR. That's mainly because they have some differences between the main Docker API. There's some AWS specific things that we added in. Generic Docker registries are supported. Also S3 is a bucket feed, and we have some steps out for pushing changes to S3 as well, or pushing packages to S3. As far as hosting in Octopus, a couple options. We do have the software that you can install on a Windows EC2 instance. You do need a database. RDS is supported. You can also host it as a container in Kubernetes or ECS. I'd really only recommend that if you are very familiar with container platforms, because they have a lot of nuances, a lot of extra stuff you need to know to make that, to host containers in those effectively. So if you're new to containers, new to those platforms, I'd probably take a look at hosting on a Windows EC2 instance for those. I would going to shout out the docs right now. If you go to octopus.com/docs, there's a getting started guide. It's like at the top of the links on our docs. There is a best practices guide, which includes installation tips, including what size like instances you would need, the details about the database, and details about the file system that you would need. We also have a hosting and Kubernetes guide that's pretty good as well. So that should cover both of those. And then there's a question in here that I do want to look at. It's a little bit of a paragraph, so I'm going to try to read it, James, and we'll figure it out as we go. All right, so we have an old 2012 server running Octopus 3.17.14. Don't think upgrading in place is worthwhile considering 2012 is into life. How would I go about updating an existing DB to add new columns? Can I create a new instance from scratch and transfer projects and runbooks? What's the best way forward in this case?
Yeah. So I saw this one come through, and there's certainly a few pieces to unpack here. So one piece, you're running Octopus 3.17, 3.x. Any 3.x version can be upgraded to any modern version just straight through. There's no upgrade path that you need to follow in that case.
Yeah, I'm navigating to the docs while you're talking, James.
Yeah.
Because we do have a somewhere. Is it not under administration? We have an upgrade guide as well. And I think the upgrade guide will answer, oh, I'm in security somehow. That's why I can't find it. Upgrading Octopus. The upgrade guide, really good. It'll walk through all the scenarios. We have a page specifically for going from 3.x to the latest version. This will walk through everything you need to prep work. Yeah, I wouldn't go in place. I would set up your database can probably stay in place. That's fine. You can move it to a new database server, to a new database if you want to. But yeah, set up a new Octopus server, point it to your database, and do an upgrade from there, and then decommission the old one. That's probably the way I'd go about it. All the details are in this link. We can share that with you if you want to email advice@octopus.com. Our solutions team can also give you extra guidance around doing the upgrades, but we can also get this to you. Like I said, it's under our docs, under administration, upgrading Octopus right there. So if you want to make a note of that, but feel free to reach out. We can give you some extra info and a link to this as well through that email. All right. Any other questions? I'm taking a look at the live question, the Zoom Q&A. I'm taking a look at the
Slack, not seeing any community Slack.
All right. And well, then I think we are good. Hopefully those questions, I really like those questions, especially the upgrade. I love that we got an upgrade in place where we're going to maybe decommission an old Octopus server, get it something new and shiny. The difference between 3.17 and any of the major, like the most recent modern releases, there's so many good features in there. You're going to get runbooks, you're going to get workers, you're going to get all these new steps. So we've that deploy a release step that I mentioned, that's going to be in there. 3.17 has tenants, so that wouldn't be new, but definitely a lot of new stuff available, especially with support for all these container platforms and more cloud native targets. So yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for sending that in. Thanks for everybody else who sent in their questions. If you do have more questions, there's a few different avenues where you can reach out to us. So if you are new to Octopus, if you're trialing it or thinking about trialing it, not a current customer, feel free to reach out to sales@octopus.com. That's me and James, along with the rest of our teammates. We're here to kind of help you evaluate Octopus and decide if it is the right tool for you and how it can best fit into your current environment. If you are an existing customer or you have some other questions around how to do something specific in Octopus, especially around those upgrades, or maybe in a certain question about your process, how to best use that deploy or release step, that's where our solutions team comes in. Advice, ADVICE @octopus.com. They will help you with those. Great team over there as well. A lot of the stuff we showed, a lot of stuff we mentioned Mark with the pipeline that comes from our solutions team. All right, finally, if you enjoyed this webinar, if you like our content, you like our videos, you want to see more awesome content from Octopus, all of our previous webinars, as well as other video content, we do more than just webinars. Those can be found on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/octopusdeploy. Go subscribe, get the latest updates from there. Maybe you're watching this in the future as a YouTube recording. Go ahead and click that subscribe button if you appreciated this content and these question and answers. Maybe hit a like, drive the likes up on this video. And speaking of webinars, our next one is 2 weeks from today. There's 3 sessions. It's a joint webinar with Microsoft where we're going to be diving into more infrastructure as code. So if that's something on your radar, something you're looking to maybe incorporate into your DevOps process, maybe add into your Octopus deployments, checking out runbooks, go sign up for that webinar. All that being said, again, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for your questions. I've had a lot of fun doing this. James, thanks for joining me. Thanks for co-hosting and writing out these webinars with me and answering these off-the-cuff questions.
Certainly, it was a blast.
All right. Again, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. And until next time, happy deployments.